Listeners, have you ever grieved the loss of a friend? Someone dazzling, flawed, and deeply loved? Or have you ever wondered how laughter, silence, and even text messages can become part of the story we tell about those we've lost? In today's episode of the Writing and Resilience podcast, I talk with writer Eirinie Carson about her breathtaking debut memoir, The Dead Are Gods, and her forthcoming novel, Bloodfire Baby. Together, we explore how writing can both preserve and transform our grief, why it's so important to show loved ones in their full humanity, and what it means to let go of a story that once felt like holding on to the person themselves. Plus, Eirinie will share one of the most surprising things she learned about how we structure a book and the conversations it encourages, as well as those that get silenced. This is a tender, honest, and at times surprisingly joyful conversation about love, loss, and the power of writing to help us live with both. Let's dive in. Welcome to Writing and Resilience, the podcast for writers who want to write and live the story that sets them free. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison, a writer, transformational and trauma-informed coach, story alchemist, and fellow traveler on the winding road of healing and creativity. Each week, I'll share tools, practices, and conversations that will help you let go of what no longer serves you as you create stories that change lives, especially your own. Together, we'll explore how to trust your creative voice, support your mental health and resilience, work with your nervous system and unique design, and stay connected to your deepest calling as a writer, even when life gets messy. It's time, my friends, to write and live the story that sets you free. I'm honored to walk that journey alongside you, one story and one episode at a time. Well, hello, Eirinie. Welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast. I'm so excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's my joy to see you again because we got to work together at the San Francisco Writers Conference where we had a chance to talk about your book, The Dead Are Gods. And I am so excited to revisit that conversation and to take it a little deeper because this book is amazing. You just have this beautiful voice and this wonderful way of honoring your friend Larissa and taking us into this relationship. But we're going to go into that. But before we do, I always like to give my guest an opportunity to share what they would like us to know about you and then also about your book.
Oh, what a great question. I am a Black British writer. I'm from London. I live in the Bay Area now. And I'm a mother of two small people and a wife of one, big person. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
And you've had this very storied life before you were a mother to two small people and a wife to a big person. You were working on another project, which we'll talk about at the end. But before you were doing this, you had this life, and Larissa was a part of that. And so I want to dive into your book and just begin by saying, I love this for so many reasons. One, there's so many intersections between your experience and my experience in terms of the music that we were listening to. We both got a chance to talk about Skunk and Nancy, which is one of my favorite bands, and all of the things that were happening, though I am certainly not a model. But you had all of these experiences with your friend Larissa. And so when you were thinking about writing about friendship and grief, which is a topic that doesn't get written about as much, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it was kind of an accidental writing, to be honest. It started as a eulogy for Larissa's funeral, and it just kind of spiraled out of control. I couldn't stop writing, and it never began as a book project. It began as therapy and catharsis. And I think that, to be honest, saved me a lot from what I'm doing now with my second book, which is thinking about the audience a little too much. Because when I was writing this
Yeah.
book, the audience was either Larissa or myself. So that's what got it started. I also think when someone dies, you're left holding so much by yourself. There were so many shared stories, and I was so worried about losing them. And so a lot
Mhm.
of this was just a desire to be a historian and an archivist and get it down before I forgot it or before I misremembered it. That's kind of the genesis for me.
I love how you talked about the difference between book one and book two. And this idea that your first book had this organic beginning, right? You had this eulogy that you were going to deliver. It began there, and then you couldn't stop writing. It expanded and expanded and expanded, and then it became a book. Whereas now that you've gone through the entire process and you've published a book, there's a little audience sitting on your shoulder the whole time, and you're thinking about them as you're writing. What lessons did you learn about how to write a book and how to ignore, or I don't know, work with that idea of audience in a different way when you were working on The Dead Are Gods versus the book that you're going to publish next year in 2026? And please share the title of that book with us.
Yeah, the title of the next book is called Bloodfire, Baby, and it's a fiction. Because it turns out when you write memoir, the first thing you want to do next is write something that is made up and not tied to fact or your personal life. But the funny thing about writing is that you end up kind of coming back to yourself anyway and your own personal experiences. But I think with The Dead Are Gods, I only was kind of shaken awake by my editor when I finally sold the book to Melville House. My editor was like, talking about audience, and I was like, oh shit, someone's going to read this. Someone's going to know. It was just such a solitary thing. And I think that's something first time authors talk about a lot, that you have this private thing on your laptop, your private thoughts, and then at some point you have to say, this is done. It's fit for public consumption. And once it leaves your laptop, it's no longer yours, just yours anyway. So I think for this second book, I have a much better understanding of what it means to release a book, like quite literally release it into the world, like a wild thing. Like it has to go back. And that is what this specific type of art is meant to be consumed in that manner. And I think I'm more aware of that responsibility and what that means and how it will feel. And I think that's sort of a double-edged sword, because there is a kind of freeze that happens when you think about the audience. And if you think about the audience too much and you begin catering to an audience that is imagined, you can kind of lose your voice. And when I've been writing the second book, I've spent a lot of time kind of trying to meditate prior to beginning so that I can get back into my own head and stop thinking about all of the bloggers and the magazines and the podcasts that I know are out there now that I didn't know about before.
Yeah, I love that you're using meditation and you're really trying to get back into your own head versus thinking about the heads of all of these people around you who may have an opinion about what you have written. Because it's so important to think about the fact that when you're writing, whether you're writing creative nonfiction or fiction, some aspect of the story is your life, right? Your characters in this new book, they are not you. Their experiences are not your experience, but there's always some question that haunts us, some aspect of our emotional lives that ends up on the page. And so giving yourself space to be able to work through that, understand what that is, and do it within great storytelling is so important. And then once that's been done, thinking, okay, well, what else does my audience need? How is this serving the story? How is it serving them is so important. And I love that we're talking about this end part of the process first, because I think it can be so hard with grief to let projects go. When you were thinking about this project being done, and for those who don't know who Larissa is, could you share when she died? And so then we have a sense of like, how recent is this loss for you?
Yeah, Larissa died in 2018. It was a sudden death, as in we didn't know it was coming. And I went to her funeral in November, I believe, of 2018 in Paris, which was where she was living and where she died. It's funny to think about it because it at once feels like, seconds ago and then a millennia ago. And in writing this book, The Dead Are Gods, I sort of entombed her in this book, and it almost has this life of its own. It's kind of funny to think about. Like, I have my grief, it is mine. And yet I wrote about it extensively, and now it's in the world. And so it's kind of living this dual life. And it was published in 2023. I guess it was 5.5 years that I was working on it from conception to publication. As I said, I didn't really think about it as a book for a while. And a funny thing that happens when you are writing your trauma is that you can be re traumatized at any point by a random stranger who has read your book. And I think I kind of had a notion of that. I had a therapist who I loved throughout my book tour. We were working very closely together to make sure that I felt protected and prepared to discuss at length. And then after you've discussed at length, to have this like Q&A situation with an audience, often of grieving people. And so I was often having to hold a lot of other people's grief. People really want to share because we have so few avenues in which we can share
Yes.
about our grief in our society. And so I would often hear similar stories or stories that were just, they're weighty. They have a weight to them. And I was carrying a lot. And I think I've learned a lot about boundaries and how I keep myself safe when talking about trauma. Because although Bloodfire Baby is not, it's fiction, it deals with postpartum grief and psychosis. And that is a minefield for me as a twice postpartum person. So
Yeah. So learning how to hold space for your own experience, let someone else have their experience and not take it on is a huge piece of how you care for yourself in that publication space. And, when I think about my own projects and writing about grief and writing specifically about my brother's death by suicide, my brother has been gone for a long time, like 30 years. I would say that your grief is pretty new. 5 years is not that long. I mean, society will tell you that it's ancient, but it's not, right? That's young grief. It's been almost 30 years since my brother died. And there is a way that he lives again on the page. We have this relationship that, in some ways, in my case, is stronger than it was when he was alive because we can have these different kinds of conversations through the stories and experiences that we shared. And I think when I work with other writers, sometimes when they're writing in the grief space, or if they're writing about other kinds of traumas where they weren't able to have the kind of relationship they wanted to have with a person, that writing can become so precious. That relationship on the page can feel so alive. And you know that once you let it go, you're letting go of that person again in a way. And I'm wondering, how did you navigate that piece, or was that your experience?
I definitely really what you said about your brother, what was his name?
Joe.
Joe. What you said about Joe and how your relationship kind of continues resonates so
Yeah.
much with me, I think. How well can we ever know the people we love? I think that's a theme in my book, The Dead Are Gods. And I think that now that Larissa is dead, I have more access to her. She can't hide as well. And there are secrets that came out in writing the book, in grieving her, that I wonder if I would have seen fully or been able to hold in the same way because I am processing this all by myself. I'm processing the way that she died. I don't have her to be angry. I mean, I can be angry with her, but we're not in this push pull. And so I have done a whole lot of healing around how she died. And then the way in which she died relates directly to my own family's history of substance use. And that has been really healing too. I think that I would obviously give all of that healing back in exchange for her, but it has been a really beautiful surprise of grief and loss that I know her better than I think I did when she was living.
Yeah, that has definitely been my experience. And I think there's something about the person not being able to hide, as you just said, and also, yeah, being able to hold space for what their experience is without the frustrations that sometimes come with being in the dynamics of being in a relationship with someone, I think allows us to hold them more gently. And I think one of the things that you do in this book, The Dead Are Gods, that I think you do really well is that, there can be a way that grief is a solitary process. Obviously, this is your story, but, when we're exploring our story, the people that are gone, they don't have a voice. And you were able to give Larissa a voice in your story by doing something really unique structurally, which is you include these text messages throughout. And when we were at the San Francisco Writers Conference, the number in my head is like 4,000. And I don't know if that's the right number, but how many of these text messages did you have that you went through to figure out which ones belonged in the book?
Oh my God, so many. I don't even think I have a number. If I said 4,000, it was hyperbole. I think it's up there for sure. I had so many. When I had kind of come to the realization that it was a book, it was just very sad. It was a very sad book. And she wasn't a very sad person. She was brilliant and alive. And I wanted some of that life. I wanted a breathing, a moment of breath between chapters. And I had all these voice notes that we'd sent each other back and forth. And I wanted that in them. And so I turned to our emails and our texts, and I had so many. And so I tried to pick emails or texts that spoke to the chapter they precluded. And I think in doing so, it's not just a eulogy of my grief. You can hear her. You can hear how she talked and her grammar mistakes and her silliness and all of this beauty that if I just told you it wouldn't feel quite as poignant, maybe.
And I think when we think about writing and storytelling and also the concept of show don't tell, when you write a eulogy often puts the person who is gone on a pedestal. I'm going to tell you the best possible, most perfect story I can about who this person is. I'm going to share the highlight reel. And yet, in storytelling, we can't develop our characters that way because A, it's boring, and B, it's not how people really are. And you could have shared so many things like Larissa took a really long time to get ready, or Larissa did these things that are inconvenient or inconvenienced me. And we would experience that story in one way, and you could even develop a scene. But when we see some of these text messages, I think it brilliantly shows the things that you are trying to share on the page. Because I would have these scenes and I would say, okay, that would be annoying, but how annoying would it be, or how, challenging? Oh, there's the text message and the text chain, and we see the time, and it gives another layer to what that experience is.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you felt that. That was my hope. Yeah, she wasn't a perfect person. And I think remembering her as this kind of flat, eulogized human does a real disservice to her nuance and her layers. And some of the more fascinating things about her weren't particularly palatable. And I loved them anyway. So I was happy to share this image of a flawed woman. That's who I loved and that's who I wanted to show.
And I think the fact that you did that allowed me to love her too, because I got to see all of her, and that was really beautiful because you share the intimacy of this relationship so well.
Thank you. I think one thing I wanted when I finally had the book was that I wanted people to love her. She was a very specific person and she was very dazzling, and most people who met her just thought she was the coolest. She was so cool. I wanted you to know those other soft underbelly parts of her, the nerdy nicknames and the terrible TV and all of the nuance of her.
Yeah, and I think one of the aspects that gave me the clearest picture of the kind of intimacy that the two of you shared were the silences. Silence is really hard to write. It's challenging for people to live through if they don't have a comfortable relationship with someone, which you obviously did. When you're thinking about writing those silences, what did you think about in terms of how to write that?
Well, I think there was the silence of her as a friend, how often we were quiet together, and how that was mostly wonderful. Not always, but mostly. And then there was also the silence that she left when she died, that I live in. And I always knew what her silence meant when she was living. I never felt personally slighted. I knew that it was actually a deep bond that we had, that we were able to be silent together. And so in her death, I kind of had to figure out and translate what that silence could mean. And I think writing about it, I mean, at the very beginning, this book really chronicles my grief, the early parts of my grief, and it's very raw and often is like as written and not too edited. You can almost feel the echo of the silence in the beginning of me talking to myself and trying to understand this loss. So, in that way, I feel like the silence is really lonely. And then as the book progresses, it's almost like divination or something. I feel like you begin to hear the voice of Larissa because you've learnt it now. I and the reader, hopefully, are in conversation with this dead person, trying to make me understand this final lesson of what it means to live and love with someone who is no longer here.
I love that. And I love how you talked about voice, because one of the treats that we had at the San Francisco Writers Conference, which just was, this extemporaneous moment, which I loved, was that we got to hear Larissa's laugh. I don't know if you have your phone handy or you have that track available, but I just think that it was such a rich and beautiful laugh. It leads to the question I want to ask you next. So I think it would be a great setup.
I sure do. Better believe it. I'm always ready. I have backed up this chat a million times because I'm so scared of losing it, but I have it on my phone still. A prelude is that the thing that she's laughing about is this really silly joke that someone told. This person had a boyfriend called Jim who, after sex, would say, "How did you like your gym workout?" Which is a terrible way, but that's what she's referencing. All right, let's see if we can get it going.
Gym workout. Your gym workout. Oh my god. Everybody just turned around. Just laughing so much. Your gym workout. Your gym workout. Oh my god. Your gym workout. How did you...
All right. It goes on for a full minute, and then there's a. Oh no, she's still going. There's a second. She stopped recording that one and then started again and still couldn't compose herself. But she had the world's best laugh. It was really contagious.
Oh my gosh, I love hearing it every single time because she feels so vibrant and so alive. And when I was preparing for this is kind of a new thing that I'm doing as someone who's learning to read the Akashic records. I asked, like, what am I supposed to ask you about? This is not on the list of questions that I shared, which I always share the questions. And of course, as you know, we're not talking about them. Our conversation is going in a slightly different direction. And the question was, what does laughter have to do with grief? And as you hold space for that, what do you think the answer is?
Oh my gosh. Wow. What a question. When I listen to that, there is something so alive about the sound. There's no other sound like it. But what does it have to do with grief? I suppose after so much crying, it's kind of nice to be forced to laugh with her. I think hearing her laughter in particular brings me back to love. I think with my grief journey, I have branched out to many other places like anger and fear and obviously sadness. And hearing her laugh, it just takes me back to the wick of her, the things that were most true and the things that I loved most. And it makes me smile and it makes me laugh as well. I think grief doesn't need to be endlessly sad. I think it can have these moments of levity where we laugh together.
Yeah, and I think about what sometimes happens right around a funeral, how there will be these moments of laughter between the people who are the most bereaved. And when my brother died, it was incredibly heavy because of how he died and the circumstances around it. And there was this moment after his funeral. We had just buried him and we came back to my grandmother's house, and it was me, my mom, my dad, and my brother. And we just started telling these ridiculous stories about my brother. And we were very feral kids. We're very Gen X, like go off and be out in the world and come home when the lights come on. And there were some bullies in our neighborhood, and we were not going to stand to the side. So we carried a pickaxe. That was our weapon. And I know this is ridiculous, right?
One pickaxe for all three of you, or
One,
like one each?
one pickaxe for all of us. And the pickaxe was, about 2.5, 3 feet tall. And my brother Joe, he was often the person holding the pickaxe, and he was about 3 feet tall. So you have this kid who's about 3 feet tall carrying a pickaxe down the
Oh
street.
my God.
I know it's ridiculous, right? And it was so funny to imagine him at 6, 7 years old carrying a pickaxe. We're walking down the street, and it didn't take away the heartache. But I think, as I think about his grief, the tears connect me to the love, and the laughter connects me to the life.
I love that. I do want to know where you got a pickaxe from.
We had a pickaxe underneath the house. So we were the kids who had like gasoline and a pickaxe and all kinds of stuff. We got into a lot of trouble. But yeah, it was just underneath the house. And we had sticks and we had rocks and different things. But we were like, a pickaxe is pretty effective because if you swing it at someone once, they don't come back for a second time.
Yeah,
And it worked.
that is lethal. And I also just imagine all of the strangers walking by this tiny kid being like, what is going on? That's so funny.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of kids nowadays with pickaxes. I mean, it's just
No,
not
it's rare.
happening.
It's rare. Less pickaxe work going around for sure.
So as we think about Larissa's life and we think about your book, which has been out for a while, long enough that you have written another book, which is getting ready to come out in 2026, which is exciting.
Yes.
What's a question that you have not been asked that you're like, I would really like to talk about this?
Oh, what a question. I can't remember if we talked about this at the writers' conference, but I'm having deja vu, so maybe we did. Stop me if you've heard this one before. I think that by omission, purposeful omission, during the promotion of The Dead Are Gods, I didn't really talk about the way in which Larissa died. And I didn't do that because it is set up in the book to be the very last thing you learn about her, so that you can really love her before you place stigmas on her, which we all do. And I think I'm glad that I did that in a way. And I also look back and I wonder if that had anything to do with Larissa or if that was just me. Maybe I was scared to talk about it. And I think were I to do that book tour all over again, I think I would talk about it more. I'm happy to talk about it now. The book's been out for 2 years, almost 2 years. She died of a heroin overdose. I did not know she was using heroin. And yet, that's a funny thing. Memory is so interesting and so strange because I wrote this entire book, I sold it to a publisher. And then when it came out, I was talking to some mutual friends of ours. And I was like, yeah, no, I can't believe I didn't know about the heroin. And one of them was like, didn't we talk about like having an intervention? So Larissa was missing for a week before they found her. And in this week, our friends and I were talking about what we would do when we found her. We were pissed. We were really furious at her. And I went back through our texts and I was like, oh, I talk about some form of intervention. So although I didn't know about the heroin, I knew something wasn't right. And it's so funny how in my grief, I imagine it kind of like an airbag. It like exploded and buffered me from the impact. But I really needed to see what I was being hit with. And I kind of protected myself from that. So this is a really long winded answer to your question. But I really think I wish I'd given more space from the very beginning, from the first time that I learned Larissa died. I wish I'd given more space to the way in which she died because I thought that I was doing a good job honoring her in the way that I wrote the book. But I also realized that in the way that I did it, I've kind of shoved it into the shadows again, which was the thing I was trying not to do. I didn't want it to be this taboo stigma, I wanted it to be something we could hold and say, yes, she died this way, but she was so many other things as well.
Yeah, we did talk about this at the conference, and I'm glad you brought it up again because I think you can't say these things enough. So many people who are listening to this podcast are working on a book and they're thinking about, okay, how do I create narrative tension? Right. So, narrative tension is how we keep the reader hooked and engaged and wanting to read your book. And you have used that aspect of the story as that narrative hook, and it creates that tension and this mystery that I, as the reader, I want to know the answer to. You do that really well. And so it's interesting. It makes the book successful. And yet, when you think about the conversations you want to have, in order to get people to read the book and not give away the mystery, you can't talk about the one thing that you want to talk about in order to get rid of the shame and has the stigma around addiction, especially heroin addiction, because it's one of the hardest addictions to quit. I mean, it just takes over someone's life. Any of the opiates do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the book in one of its earlier, in its like first draft form when it was done as a book, but it wasn't quite done. Something was missing and I hadn't included the way that she died, and therefore I hadn't understood its connection to my own family's substance use issues. My father used heroin throughout my childhood. He's sober now, yay, and doing great, but that stands. And I just wasn't really advancing in the book draft. I just felt like I was like banging my head against a wall. I couldn't figure out how it came back to the ending because I write all my endings first. So I knew how it was going to end and I just couldn't get there. And a friend of mine suggested, just as an experiment, writing about my father, writing about Larissa's death, in the actual event of her death. And I did. And it kind of unlocked this understanding of the book for me and what this journey of grief was leading me through, and how it was helping me understand the trauma of my childhood that I was still holding on to, even though I thought I'd processed it, and why Larissa's death was so particularly painful to me, because I loved her and knew her better than my father, who survived heroin and was able to get sober, but I lost her. And so now I'm in this really funky place of building a relationship with a father I never thought I would spend time with. And some of me kind of wishes it was Larissa instead of him. But I think I had to write about it. I had to get there. I really had to go into the tough stuff. And I think that's a lesson for grief in general, that we have to go to the hard places to process.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a really important point, is that grief tends to unlock or connect us to all of these other issues in our lives that also are places of pain. The pain of loss connects us to these other pain points, which can be really uncomfortable, but it also offers an opportunity for those spaces to heal if we can make space for them, if we can take a look at them. And what I'm hearing about your writing process is that as you were writing this book, and I love how you talked about, it wasn't just, I thought the book was done, but something was missing. So you had to do this other work. And then it unlocked everything, that you had to really look at how Larissa died and how the nature of how she died affected or connected to other experiences in your life, how they all come together, which you bring together in your book. And I think what I love about this podcast is, because this is really for writers, there are no spoilers, right? I talk about how stories are built all the time, and we talk about endings, and you should still go read a book, because what you get to do when you have conversations like this is people get to see how you build it, right? How it works and why it works. And I think that can be a really rich way of experiencing a story.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, no spoilers.
Right. No bad spoilers. Also, I would say I love that you talked about writing the ending first. In a project I'm working on right now, I wrote the ending. And if I know the ending, then just like you said, I know how to get there. I know where I'm going,
Yeah,
which I think, especially in memoir, when people are writing first draft, there's so many different places it can go. And if you don't know where you're going, you can have like 400 pages of chaos and you don't know how to shape it. So having an ending in place can be a great way to do it if you know your ending. It's not to
yes.
say you can't write these other ways, right? There's no rules.
Totally. And the ending can tweak once you get there too. You can realize that something has to change. Endings come to me first. And it is exactly what you said. You have a destination and you can kind of trace it backwards if you want and figure out the steps.
Yeah. And I think that can be really helpful, though some people like to go forward. Well, when you think about your novel that is going to be coming out in 2026, Bloodfire Baby, did you also know the ending to that book first?
Yes, truly, endings are the first thing I write. Yes, I knew the last paragraph of the book, and it is basically as I first wrote it, still in the draft, in the final draft we're on now. That was the key.
Well, because I love your style, I love your voice, I love the way you put words together. I can't wait to read your novel.
Oh, thank you.
And the pre-order period is here, right? So people can take a look at that in the show notes. They can click on it. They can buy a copy of Bloodfire Baby along with The Dead Are Gods. And so that's going to be in the show notes. But what else is going to be in the show notes in terms of how people can connect with you and learn more about what you're doing?
Well, my website, eiriniecarson.com. I try to keep it updated with my movements. And I am on Instagram and Blue Sky and sometimes TikTok. And you can find me because my name is really unique and there won't be another one. So,
I can't imagine there ever being another one of you.
oh, thank you. That's so sweet.
I mean that. You are such a beautiful, bright light. And I love what you bring to our conversations around grief. And I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate being here and I loved learning more about Joe and your pickaxes.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about Eirinie and most importantly, buy copies of her books, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would text the show if you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with the answer to the following question. What's the name of your best friend, that dearest person in your heart? Maybe you're not going to write a memoir about them, but writing their name here is a way to honor them and for us to hold them in our hearts. And here's the name of my best friend, Becky Fuller. Thank you, Becky, for 41 years of friendship and counting. I look forward to seeing where this takes us. And I look forward to hearing who you honor so I can say their name too. In the meantime, I'd like to give a special shout out to writer Jane Hammonds, who gave my encore episode with Amy Lynn some love. It was so wonderful to hear from you, Jane. And listeners, I would love to hear from you too. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you set yourself free. And that, my friends, is how we save the world. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways that you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review so others can find the show. 3, join my engaged, dynamic community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Ditch Your Inner Critic, 5 tools to transform self-doubt into self-support. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you become not just the writer, but the person you're meant to be. And that, my friends, is the real freedom writing can offer.